Thank you, everybody, for coming out this afternoon. And thank you, Dr. Pippa, for joining us. I'm really honored to have you here. As mentioned this morning, it's your first time at my conference, and that means a ton because I've been reading your content for a long time. There's a handful of directions I want to go here. We're going to cram as much in as we can.
Sure.
I want to pull on some threads that you shared this morning on our panel conversation, and one that a few people asked me about after I got off stage. You discussed how the next frontier will be the technological frontier. And we were talking about war at that part of the conversation. And you said, yes, but the next frontier of battle is happening in tech. And obviously that makes intuitive sense. A handful of people grabbed me afterwards and they said, but how does she reconcile that when tensions really brew to the surface, as in Europe and the Middle East, we still get back to bullets and tanks? So I just wondered if you had any thoughts to share on that perspective.
Look, there are a lot of, it's like layers of an onion. There are a lot of things happening at once. One is, we in the United States spend trillions of dollars on defense equipment, and we think that buys us security. But when I was in the White House, we were literally overcome by $5 box cutters you can buy at any hardware store, and the turning of an aircraft into a missile. Fast forward to today, what the Israelis did with Hamas with the pagers is like, okay, what's the actual firepower of technology? And the answer is very inexpensive technologies are overcoming extremely expensive technologies. So there's a massive step change that I think the people who run traditional militaries can't quite get their head around. So the battle zone is changed in that what you think will protect you isn't protecting you anymore. So that's one layer. Another layer is when you're conducting operations that the public can't see. So we've had a number of press announcements about events in space. Boeing recently had an anomalous event with one of their satellites. The British had a satellite from the late 70s that suddenly showed up in a completely different part of space with no explanation as to how it got there. We go, okay, if we even see those headlines, if you haven't clicked on space stories, your news feed, the algorithms won't even give you those stories. But if you're in that realm, you understand this is related to the fact that only the US and China have satellites with arms that can go up to another satellite, pick it up, and literally hurl it into another part of space. And of course, this matters because we're so dependent here on Earth on satellite networks. And we've seen the Chinese do that. They have picked up one of their own satellites and hurled it. They didn't pick one of ours because then that would have been an act of war, but they did it with their own and it sent a very powerful signal. So there's a reason the Pentagon has said space is the most important warfighting domain now. People haven't quite understood why is that. It's because all the communications, guidance systems, everything is space-based. So those are some of the layers of this story, and then you can take it into not just going out into space, but going down into the subatomic structure of reality, where nanotechnology, the creation of biological warfare at the level of viruses, these are all very real things, right? There was a very interesting article, I think it came out in quite a long time ago, in 2012, called Hacking the President's DNA. And it was all about that our DNA sequencing systems now allow you to create a disease that will affect only one person. So if you get the president's DNA, you can do that. What does the Secret Service do now? They spend a lot of time cleaning up the president's DNA, not just guarding the president, but guarding their genetics, if you see what I mean. So we are not thinking about conflict on all these different levels. But that is where it's happening. So that's why I say the technological frontier is the new battle zone. We just are used to thinking of conflicts because of photo ops. So we see tanks, boots on the ground, we're like, oh, that's a war zone. We don't see events in space or in, biological labs. So therefore we don't think of it that way. But that doesn't mean it isn't.
Yeah, okay. I have to restate two things that I just heard, because I don't know if anyone else in the room had not heard those before. The first being satellites that are armed with arms to approach other satellites, grab them, and throw them out of orbit.
Exactly.
I'd heard about this from your writing, but remarkable and so science fiction-esque, it's hard to wrap your mind around. The part that I had not heard legitimately, though, is the personalized DNA warfare. That's absolutely terrifying.
Terrifying.
I mean, I'm
Totally.
even struggling for a question to ask off of that, but the one I want to ask is, how aggressively are we pursuing countermeasures? What do those look like? And both of these concepts that you discussed, the space warfare and genetic warfare, those are covert wars. So the extent to which they could be incredibly active today and entirely off our radar
Yes.
is tremendous.
Well, I think this is why I use the term the invisible war. And as I said this morning, I've been writing a lot in recent years about the hot war in cold places, the cold war in hot places, because people are so focused on Ukraine because you can send in a photographer. Also, to be fair, there's this old rule in journalism, which is if it bleeds, it leads, meaning if there's a deceased human, then there's a human interest story. A satellite without a deceased human, there's no human interest story there. I spoke to a couple of the editors of the major newspapers, and for example, I said, I mentioned the incident this morning where somebody cut the cable that connected our satellites to the subsea cable network. And I said, why are you not reporting this? This is a major event. It marked the beginning of subsea cable warfare. And all of us have a phone on us. We're all dependent on that subsea cable network. And the reply I got was, people think Wi-Fi is in the air. So if you have to explain that it comes from a satellite connecting to a subsea cable, that's 2 paragraphs, you've already lost the audience. They'll never read it. Right. People are not interested in the technicalities. And I'm like, maybe they're not wrong about that. We live in a world where it's maybe just too hard to understand the technology. I don't know. That baffles me.
Well, we don't do well in general sitting in uncertainty.
Yes.
As a species, like we're not comfortable there. So we'll typically gravitate towards whatever solution we can justify and sit with that, even if it's wrong.
Yes.
Because knowing something, even if it's incorrect, is more comfortable than not knowing something, right? So here's my question for you. So much of this is off-radar, covert operation, therefore pretty tough for us to know the extent of which it is active, therefore kind of tough to know who the main stakeholders would be. My question is, over the last few months, there's been this surge of questionable drone activity across the United States, primarily, close to sensitive infrastructure, nuclear bases, military bases, et cetera, et cetera. Very few answers as to what's going on here. What's your take?
So for background, I'm a former manufacturer of drones. That was my first big startup. So I have been in the drone space for more than 10 years, roughly. So recently, Congressman Jim Himes came out and said, and he's the ranking member on the House Intelligence Committee, and he said, it's not Russians, it's not Chinese, it's not us, it's not Martians, it's teenagers in New Jersey with Walmart drones. And I was like, well, first of all, Walmart doesn't sell drones that are the size of a car. And if they do, I'm going to go buy one. Like, that's interesting. But second, we should be totally hiring these teenagers. They're very brilliant. And by the way, it's not just in New Jersey. It's all over the country, and it's worldwide. But the press isn't reporting the worldwide nature of these events. some of the news stations are picking up on this and showing a map of the location of these drones over U.S. nuclear facilities, over U.S. weapons depots, highly, highly sensitive locations, plus locations like the White House. So this kind of, you're imagining it, there's nothing to see here, this is not working. So I think it's a very complex story, and my own personal view is that it's a lot of ours, meaning U.S. government. It's some of theirs, meaning Chinese. Are the Chinese and the Russians working together? And, do we have the possibility of special ops type people operating inside the United States? I think this is a possibility. We don't like to talk about that because, the idea that a conflict is occurring inside the United States is so difficult for people to process. Again, the war must be somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So, but is it possible that we're getting some blowback from what's happening in Ukraine with activity in the U.S.? Yes, I think that is a possibility. It's not to be discussed. Again, it's in the hybrid gray zone. Let's not talk about that. Then there's another really interesting, further complicating matter, which is this whole non-human intelligence, anomalous phenomena, which I personally knew nothing about until lockdown happened. And a number of people I know from my government days, my White House days, came and said to me, you need to look at this. And I was like, oh, come on, seriously? And then I did look, and I realized Congress was passing significant whistleblower legislation and protections. There were extremely high-level intelligence officers and U.S. military personnel testifying to Congress under oath. And I realized there's no way all that is happening if this is made up. And I found myself in agreement with Senator Rubio, who's about to be our Secretary of State, who basically said either all of our top, most highly classified personnel are all losing their marbles at the same time, in which case we have a problem, or they are not, in which case we have a problem. Right? And so I do think, now that I've been digging into that subject, there is something happening. I think this itself is an incredibly complex subject. There's an incredible amount of effort that goes into suppressing, denying, removing the discussion of it from the public domain. But the incoming president and the most senior cabinet officials have all made public statements saying this needs to be unveiled. This needs to be revealed, what we know. Now, what do we know? This is a really open question. But I have a suspicion that part of the reason that drones are going up is because when the phenomena appears, we have learned that sending fighter jets after it is dangerous. And our Navy pilots have reported that they're not just seeing them, but when they get close to them, their engines start failing. Luckily, our pilots are very good at retrieving fighter jets out of the sky as they drop out of it. But it's dangerous. And that is why guys like Ryan Graves have gone to Congress and said, we have a problem here because like billions of dollars of defense equipment, highly expensive aircraft, and really highly trained personnel are being put at risk by this thing. So it's like the most interesting public policy issue I have ever seen in my entire career. And the level of effort that's going into trying to not have a conversation about it is incredible. So I come back to when Congress starts saying, it's not this, it's not that, it's not that. And I'm like, we don't know what it is, and we know we don't know what it is. So it's all of the above, which makes it really messy and difficult to have a conversation about.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And the stories of the, the F-35s approaching the UAVs and experiencing engine failure, electronic failure. right? And there's been a few stories of that with ships as well, I believe. And inexplicably, they're not sure what this thing is that approaches, but when it does, electrical failure, full system. That's terrifying, especially if you're in an airplane. So when you were discussing this, the drones initially, and it struck me as this may be a feint, right? Because we're having these drones pop up all over the U.S. and globally, and we're not getting answers as to where they're from or what they are. But you could say, well, somebody knows, and whoever knows is maybe sending a signal to somebody who doesn't know, right? Back to the sort of the feinting of not war, right?
Yes.
The Chinese satellite that's throwing its own satellite just to show somebody else what it can do. We're going to make these drones appear, make headlines. We know what they are. We're not going to say it, but you know that you don't know what they are, and so it must be us. Some sort of back and forth like this. You mentioned a shifting U.S. administration, and there's been a bit of a promise of new levels of transparency.
Yes.
We're going to talk about some of the things we haven't yet. Maybe this is a big one, right? Do you put a lot of weight on that? Do you think this new administration will come in with a bit of a new philosophy? There's enough new stakeholders involved that will experience something like that?
Well, that is the promise that they have made, and they've been so vocal about it that most of the government establishment has been trying very hard to make sure that these key people don't get confirmed.
Yeah,
so there's a fear that,
right.
that they mean it.
Yeah.
And that ranges from Kash Patel as the new FBI director to propose senior people for the CIA to many different agencies. So there's clearly a fear of making public things that have been secret. But yeah, I think it's going to happen anyway, and it's partly because a lot of what has been made secret was a function of World War II and things that were done in the 1950s that no longer work. So, for example, after the invention of the atom bomb, we basically took theoretical physics and put it on the other side of like a glass wall. Said you can't study this unless you get a classified status and you join a government lab. If you tried to study nuclear physics on your own, and if you certainly tried to build anything, you'd definitely be arrested, right? And it made sense in 1950.
Sure.
Today, I don't know if you guys have seen the clips from Andreessen and Horowitz, the key venture capital investors, but they were, invited to the White House to talk about artificial intelligence. And they were told, look, don't even bother trying to build AI startups. We, the White House, are going to designate a few. They will be blessed. They will be protected. They will be our allies. They won't do anything we don't want them to do. They'll do things we want them to do. And otherwise, just don't do it. And Horowitz goes, well, you can't, people are going to still keep working on the math, right? It's just math. And the folks in the White House basically said, yeah, but we're going to classify that. And they're laughing, going, we can't classify math. And they said, well, we classified physics, so we can. The thing is, you could in 1950, but you can't today because every person in this room has a phone in their pocket that has more computational power than was required to get a human on the moon, literally. We live in a world where the brilliance of human beings is distributed worldwide. So people are learning how to create AI systems using these capabilities. So you can't stop them from inventing, but their view is we can't have some teenager inventing an AI that's going to affect us all. Yeah, but they are inventing these AIs, and they are affecting us all. So I think this glass wall of secret technologies on the one side, the wall is breaking under the pressure of ever faster innovation, and they don't know how to stop that. And the answer is, in China, they try to control all this. In the US, this is not our tradition. Our tradition is to encourage the innovation. And I do think the previous administration had a more control approach, And the new administration is like run by technocrats, right? It looks like President Trump he's president, but the guys really running policy are all technocrats. And they're like, let the innovators run.
Yeah.
And our advantage will come from being more innovative, not from being more locked down.
I love that. Look, if you want to hear more from Dr. Pippa, start with Dr. Pippa's pen and podcast, published on Substack. Very easy to find, thrilling read every single time. So I highly encourage you to check that out, Dr. Pippa's pen and podcast. And Dr. Pippa's going to be joining me back on the main stage tomorrow afternoon.
I would like 5:30.
That's right. We're closing down the show.
Yeah.
So tomorrow afternoon we'll be back on the main stage. Thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you so much.